All right, we're back. We are COMP125 in the summer 2018 semester, and we are week 6, part 1 of our broadcast. We're talking about form validation today and form controls a little bit more. I'm also going to start introducing regular expressions a little early, only because it's supposed to be week 9, but you need some pattern matching to do proper form validation, so they kind of go hand in hand. But first, let's talk about some administrative things. One, just a reminder, Friday is assignment 2. That's when it's due, right? Assignment 1, I've been looking at it, going slow. Some really good assignments and not so good assignments. That's just the way it is. But I'll have it marked. I thought it was going to be marked already, but I had to go back and look at it again and again because there's some people that have done stuff that at the beginning I was like, no, that's no good. And then afterwards I was like, well, maybe it's okay. So I've had to go back. So that's one of the things. A reminder that next week, on Wednesday of next week, we have our test. It's an in-class assignment that you'll be given to complete within a 2-hour time frame. There will be no extra time allotted unless you have a special consideration or something like that. So please come on time. It'll run again within 15 minutes. I won't allow you to enter the class anymore because it'll disrupt everybody too much. I'm not going to go over the assignment more than once, so I'll talk about it once with you guys at the beginning of the test, and then away you go. It's an individual kind of assignment that you'll have to run on your own, and it'll be covering the stuff we've already covered in assignment 1 and assignment 2. All the exercises we've covered are fair game, but probably if you look at assignment 1, assignment 2, I think those 2 assignments will be closer to what you need to do well. So that's really, in a nutshell. I'll do a little bit more of a review next week on Tuesday, right? Because Tuesday is more of a review day. We'll run into some, hey, how's it going? And then from the second half of the semester is going to be a little bit more challenging, only because we're going to be introducing more objects and all that kind of stuff. Things that you've done. I mean, if you've kind of been in class or following the videos and doing the the required work, the exercises and so on, which I will remark this week, then it shouldn't be so bad. I think you should do fairly well in the on the test next week, right? But just a reminder. It's not a small amount. I believe it's worth at least 15 or 20% from what we talked about. So it's like an assignment. So treat it like that. It's not a small thing, and it can affect your grade to a great degree if you don't show up. That would be very bad, right? So please make sure you come on time and all that. Go through the assignment 2, assignment 1. There will be both parts of the assignments in there. Primarily with, just basically basic JavaScript manipulation. You should know Bootstrap. You should understand how to do GitHub. Those kind of things. I probably won't ask you to do it live next week. Probably won't say, make it live. I probably won't do that. There's no time for that. And it takes some time for it to propagate anyway. So there probably won't be a live component. I haven't done that in the past anyway. I'd have to look at it again. So, those kinds of things. But there's been a lot of learnings. I mean, like a lot of stuff I've seen, some really good things, and some, like I said, some things that aren't so good. But if you keep trying to do stuff with the exercises that I've given you and you attend class, I think you'll be fine. All right, so just a recap of last week. Last week was a big week. We talked about DOM manipulation with JavaScript. I'm just going to pull up last week's lesson one more time, just only because there's just so much. Let's try this again. Yeah, okay, it was already up. There's just so much we talked about last week, and I don't want to skim over it because it can be. There's a lot. Anyways, there's just a lot of stuff we cover. So one of the things we've been working with so far is multiple HTML files. And then last week I went about splitting across different files. All right. So this is the old way of splitting across different files. And what I mean by that is we're not using the ECMAScript methodology of splitting across files because we're creating these ifs for each files. Content, as an example, if you notice, is happening, and this is just from last week as a review. It's just our object that we're using to house or to represent the namespace. That's what it is. It represents a container for all the classes, or if you want to call the functions that exist outside of the app.js file. That's all that is, right? So it's a convenient way of grouping everything together, right? That's what we've done. I'm using a namespace. Namespaces are not new. They're being used in C#, C++, Java, different languages. They call them different things. Java calls them packages, right, and so on. But namespaces is what they are. Modules is another name for that, module or namespace. And all they do is they encapsulate the functions or classes in the future, and they have a certain syntax. And we talked about that last week, where you have the IFI at the top. You pass in some kind of object or variable. In this case, it looks like a variable. And at the bottom, we pass it back out. And what we do is we create this content namespace. That's what's happening here. Okay. So if you notice at the end, it becomes this, this object. And the object, remember we talked briefly about objects. To add a parameter to an object, we just use the dot accessor. So we say whatever the object name is, dot, and then whatever the new property is. And once we assign it, it declares it. That's how it works in JavaScript, because it's prototypal uses prototypal inheritance and prototypal kind of classes as opposed to the classical way of doing things that you're learning now in C# and COMP123, right? So it's a little different, the declaration syntax and so on, right? So that's an example. This is the home.js. We also have the about.js, and notice the pattern is the same. The only thing that I don't do here at the top, because we've already declared the content object, I don't want to redeclare it up here over and over again. So that's not what I want to do. We have also been using let a lot, let instead of var. I also have to tell you that there are some older browsers that won't support it. And in fact, some of the new functions that we're going to be learning over the next course of weeks are not going to be supported on all browsers, the older browsers. And that's because of, the latest standards don't always apply to some of the older browsers. And they're still out there, i.e. Internet Explorer is still out there, right? Older versions of browsers on older phones are still out there, right? And so we have to look at some, you should already have looked at this, but there are some sites that can help with this. So HTML5 test, if you look at html5test.com, you should know this site. It's something that we would have discussed if we were in the COMP125 course, if we were doing it. It talks about, HTML5 and how compatible the browser that I'm currently using is. So example, my browser, which is Chrome in this particular case, has 528 points out of 555. And it kind of tells you which points pass and which points fail based on new HTML5 features. As you can see, that they're not all kind of working. This is just HTML5. We're not even talking JavaScript yet. So you can see browser, some elements, most of them are working. You can see that the numbers, 27 out of 30 elements are working or that are compatible. Video, 29 out of 33, and so on. This is for Chrome. And if I brought up other browsers, let's see if I can bring up Edge. I don't know if I even have that, if I didn't remove that. I did. I have it here. So here's Edge. This is from Microsoft, of course. So if I do the same thing, if I do HTML5 tests, and I kind of do that, and I go to the HTML5tests.com, and it's going to have a different score, right? So you can see that there's only 471 out of 555 points with this version of Edge. Okay, that's quite a difference. If you notice, like that's a big difference. So why do we use Chrome when Edge is, has other things here? And there's a school of thought that basically says, we should really focus on the stuff that Edge can take because it's the lowest kind of level. Or Safari is pretty good. I don't know if I've installed Safari on this system, but you can check it yourself. You can also use it on mobile devices. If you try your mobile device, it'll be a different number than 528 or whatever, or 471. And they'll have different things that they support. And here's an example of this. So here's Edge. It supports 22 out of 30 elements as opposed to 27 out of 30 elements for Chrome. So that's just one thing. So HTML5test.com is something that I look at. And let's take a look at some other things. The other one I like to use a lot is Can I Use? CanIUse.com, which is, I think, a very valuable site to look at. And so let's say I want to, look for a particular thing. An example of that would be require. If I was going to type require, you can see that. So there's a certain thing here. If there's something I wanted to look at, here's form validation. So form validation, method of setting required fields and field types without requiring JavaScript. That's HTML5. You can see that for the most part, most browsers, i.e. Edge, Firefox, and so on, 97.26% penetration. I think this is a good amount. That kind of shows us that the require keyword to use on a form is pretty good. Okay, that's something we can think about. But what about other things? What about things like class, the keyword class, which is something we'll be looking at? Class lists, remember we talked about class list, again, 97.26%. As we go down, ES6 classes, which we're going to be talking about second half semester, well, old IE 11 doesn't support it. And same with Opera Mini and some older Samsung browsers and so on. For the most part now, it's not bad. 88.31% penetration. That's, globally, that's not bad, right? So I think it's pretty good. And so on. You can see get elements by class name, 97.45%. You might think that that's a normal thing, but actually, not all browsers support. And we can go on, and there's a lot of stuff you can check here in terms of, how to do stuff. For example, create element. We talked about that last week. Let's see what that looks like. If I put in create element, right? Here's create element, and it says DOM core level 2 properties. Actually, just put create in there. Maybe that'll help. But you can see that it'll kind of hit some of them. Web Animations API, that's kind of new. You can see it's only 75% acceptable and so on. ECMAScript 5, you can see that most ECMAScript 5 functions and classes and so on are good, right? They're acceptable and so on, right? So, I mean, again, you can put in whatever you want and check it out. The Canvas element is something we'll be covering later on this semester. So here's Canvas, basic support, looks like 97.45. That's kind of the number, right? It's not 100% because not all levels of browser, for example, Opera Mini is the one that's really bringing us down. It says it's pretty good, but not 100% supported of Canvas, right? Okay, so you can see that Canvas blend modes, CSS Canvas drawings, and there's a bunch of other ones. Off-screen canvases, not supported. It's like 0% support. But kind of a cool thing that they're bringing in. WebGL, here's one, the 3D canvas graphics, right? So WebGL is supported across all platforms except for Opera Mini, right? So that's pretty good, 93.2%, 26%. So when I see these kind of numbers up here, I'm like, okay, cool, I'm going to use it. But when I see a number like 30%, I don't know, right? I don't know if that's the right thing to do, right? So Can I Use is, again, something that you want to look at for if something, a feature is supported or not. Most of the features in most modern browsers are, but there are some things like if I put the export keyword, right? So you notice that it says JavaScript modules via script tag. So here's an example, loading JavaScript module scripts using script, type is equal to module. We're talking about, so far we've been talking about namespaces. So here's a module idea where I put in my script tag, I have an extra type attribute that shows that this particular thing is a module, right? And you can see that IE doesn't support it at all. Opera Mini doesn't support it at all. Older versions of Chrome and Firefox, no support. The browser for Android and Samsung Internet doesn't support it at all. So there's like 71.93%. Should I use type is equal to module and expect that it's always going to work? Well, if you're using Firefox, Chrome, Safari, or one of those kind of things, you're probably going to be okay for the most part. But there might be some browsers some compatibility issues with browsers. Okay. And again, I'm bringing this up to you so you understand that there's going to be some stuff that just doesn't work. So on that, with trying to make some newer features work, and we're talking about the latest version of JavaScript, which is ECMAScript 2015, 2016, 2017. They call it different things. But if I type ECMAScript, right, and if I say 2015, if I put that in there, you can see that there is a ECMAScript 2015, which, by the way, is the same as ECMAScript 6, the new language specification. The language specifications continues to move forward, so it's not just 2015 anymore. And the language specification, what it does is it adds new features to the language. So new things to JavaScript. JavaScript is evolving, right? Eventually, I think what we're going to see is that most browsers will support all the new features of ECMAScript. But if you look at ECMA International, and if I don't look at ECMA 2262, which is the specification for ECMAScript 2015, they have new announcements and stuff like this. It's not the greatest website, by the way, right? Just to point that out. But you can see that ECMAScript is the basis not for JavaScript, but also other languages. So if I click on programming languages, you can see how it affects C, C++, JavaScript, Java, a bunch of other languages. So it's kind of a specification. So when we look at ECMAScript, we also talk about ES. ES, as an example, 6. ES6. Again, if I was going to look at ES6features.org, this is one of them. You can see that there's things that we haven't covered yet that we will be covering this semester. Some of them, I can't cover all of them. There's just too much to cover. But there's tons and tons of new features. Some of the really cool ones are promises and a bunch of other stuff. Class declaration, syntax, all this kind of stuff. And it's not 100% going to be covered on browsers, all browsers. And the reason for this is because of what we just talked about. Browsers are evolving. Not all browsers, kind of support everything. And that's a problem. So we have to make sure that we are 100% compliant. And so there are some tools out there that can help us. One of them is called, and the most popular for when we use ECMAScript 6 is called Babel. Yeah. So I want to bring that to you right now. Babeljs.io. I'm going to put this on your, we'll just drop this on your Slack, on the Slack channel there. There's Babel. So what Babel does is it allows us to do something called transpiling. Okay, so we have some JavaScript, you can see on the left, and we want to put in some next-gen JavaScript, something new. As an example, here's an emoji as an example, and then we have what it looks like on the right-hand side, which is browser-compatible JavaScript. And what you can do is you can do it right in here. So if you look at this, check out our REPL to experiment more with Babel. If you go to this online site, so this is Babel, and if I write some new JavaScript on the left, it'll give me the old JavaScript on the right. For example, I'll do something like let my function, as an example, equals equal to a new or a function, right? And you can see that if I do things properly, as long as it's good JavaScript on the left, then you'll have good JavaScript on the right. But notice how it changes my let to var. That's just more compatible using var, right? Same thing if I say something like, const my name, right, is equal to Tom, right? And if I do that, then you can see it turns a const or a let into a var, right? So that's what the compatibility version looks like. Where we get really funky is when we actually have class syntax, which we'll cover in the second half of the semester, where we do something like this. So I'll say class, person, as an example, and then you can see what it does on the right-hand side as we create a constructor for name and age. We'll talk about this later on. And what it does on the right-hand side is it writes some interesting JavaScript where this dot name is equal to name, and this dot age is equal to age. Yeah, so this is the more compatible version. And there is something like this online that we can use. to kind of what it does is it's, transpiles. That's what this is doing. It's taking this new syntax, and this is kind of more of a compatible syntax that is transpiling into. And this would be 94.5% compatible with across all browsers. This would be less compatible, right? So for older browsers and compatibility, we use Babel. And Babel is also used for other front-end frameworks like React and a bunch of other stuff like that, because they have new syntax, and Babel is used to transpile from, this new modern syntax to something we're doing. Now, if you notice on the left, there's some presets. You can look at ECMAScript 2015, 2015 loose, 2016, 2017, all those ones that are out there. There's different stages of different versions. I can kind of include all those stages, and it'll make it so it's more compatible on the right. Even says React, right? And we'll talk about this so Babel is something that we can use. And in our Visual Studio Code, you can also include an extension for Babel REPL, which is right here. So you can actually install this one. And what it allows us to do is create a new Babel REPL kind of transpilation, example here in our Visual Studio Code without going to the browser, without looking at another application, just inside Visual Studio Code. And the way to access this is after you've installed that extension, if you press F1 and you type in Babel REPL, you can open up a new Babel REPL, right? And what it does is, click on it. There we go. That's how it should work, but it's not working for me today. But anyways, what it does is it actually creates a way of compiling or transpiling here on the app. And I'm wondering why. Maybe this thing has to be updated, and that's why it's happening. But or I have to restart it. I'll install that update. And if I restart Visual Studio Code, maybe it'll work. So again, why am I talking about Babel? You're going to get it. You're going to hit this at some point in your. If you're going to become a web developer, you're writing modern JavaScript, and you know what? You may need to use something that is, the latest. It makes sense. It's cleaner. Maybe it speaks to you from a JavaScript syntax perspective, but you want it to be compatible with all browsers, because guess what? Browsers may not understand what you're trying to do, this particular browser you're using, and that would be a problem. Sorry, let me just update this thing. So let's try that again. So if I press F1 and if I go to Babel REPL, yeah, it doesn't work for me, but it should work for you if you try it out. It opens a new tab and it gives you this kind of a thing. Yeah, so if I close all this up as an example, and then if I go to F1 and if I press kind of like, you can see there's tasks, terminate tasks, and then I can always go, if F1 gives me kind of like these little running, there's options that I can put in. So if I put in Babel REPL, typically what it'll do, it's not doing it for me right now, is it'll pull up two windows, one on the left and one on the right. It allows you to kind of type in Babel on the left side and have it on the right side. But typically what you want to look at is the Babel website. If you go back to Babel for a second, and by the way, Babel comes from the Bible, speaking every language, that kind of thing. That's where I think it comes from, or the idea that Tower of Babel, where, for people who, look at those kinds of things. That's the idea, I think. If you look at setup, though, here's the setup under the Babel website. Here we go. There's different kinds of setups. So you can look at for, in the browser. We're not going to do that right now. There's some compatibility issues there. Babel built-ins for CLI and the require hook. Let's look at this one. So if I go Babel, and again, I'm looking at setup on the Babel website. I'm looking at CLI, so the command line interface for Babel. And you can see here that I've got npm install, some new npm module I'm installing. Let me make that a little bigger for you guys to see it. npm install and --save babel-cli. Okay, so let's do that. So, and again, this would be inside of your application, right? Notice that it's --save -dev, which means it's a development dependency. It's not something that you need to use as an example of, for across your, your project. right? So that's your Babel stuff right there, an npm install. That's the way to do it. Let's go back to the setup again. I can also look at some other options. If you look at, it also supports backend frameworks like Node.js and so on. So you can install Babel and Node, but normally it's for front end stuff. And they also have for build systems, and we'll talk about what build systems are later on. We'll need to use one called Gulp later on if we want to do things automatically. One of the most popular ones is called Webpack. Webpack I kind of talked about before. It's kind of an advanced way of doing stuff. But let's go back to the CLI, and you can see even in the browser, it talks about the kind of how to set it up in the browser, talks about how to use it, and what to install. Okay, so there are a couple of things we want to install. One of them is this babel.preset.env. So I want to install this one first. So I'm going to go back. Notice this is in -save -dev, which means it's local to my project. And it also creates, they also recommend you create a .babelrc file that goes inside of your project. That's what it does. All right, so let's set this up. So first I'll exit out of Visual Studio Code, and you'll see why I'm doing this in a second, right? I know you guys are like, why are we doing this right now? Because I'm going to hit you second half semester, and I want to introduce it now, so it's in your head. So when I bring it back again, you're like, oh yeah, transpiling, right? Otherwise, if I do it at the end of the semester, no one's going to do it, just like we're not going to do the module splitting stuff. Yeah, so again, last week we worked with COMP125, S2018 lesson 5. I'm just going to duplicate it again. So I'm going to copy it and paste it. Tons. There's no best. There's required. What's required for you, right? And that's the thing you have to focus on. So yes, let's make this 6. We'll make it 6A. It might be a 6B. I don't know. Probably not. But you can see I have the other ones here. Again, just like before, I'm going to go in here and just destroy my .git folder because I don't need it in my new project. There it is. And what I'm going to do is in Visual Studio Code, I'm going to drag and drop my new project. There we are. So that's lesson 6. I'm going to change a couple of things. The only thing I really want to change is my package.json because I want to make this 6. Just for again, completeness is what I like to say. Really not required. But I do it anyway. All right, cool. And we already have a couple of dev dependencies. One of them is Bootstrap. Remember we talked about last week as well, this idea of @types. We're using type definition libraries to help us with jQuery and Bootstrap, any other thing, even our own. We wrote our own type definition library inside of our scripts folder, inside of our node modules @types folder. We made it under app. We created this index.dts, and we just declared inside of the content namespace. This is the declaration syntax. Again, this is only for code hinting. It does not affect the way your application runs in any way, right? So this way, if I want to kind of use my home content or about content or contact content, I can access, I can kind of gain access to this index type definition library for our app, right? And what it does, it recognizes the content object as a namespace, not just as a container. All right, so if I go back to our scripts inside my app.js, and if I go down to where I'm using everything, where I hover over content, you can see now in my Visual Studio Code, it says, hey, content is a namespace because we defined it as such, right? Sorry? No, this has nothing to do with Babel. This is to do with our @types, with our, basically our type definition library. By the way, I'm prepping you for TypeScript. So I'm going in stages. I'm starting off with JavaScript. We're going to talk ECMAScript 6 a little bit more today. Then I'm moving into Babel because Babel has to transpile into ECMAScript 5 from ECMAScript 6. So from the new standard to the old standard. That's what has to happen, right? So it's more compatible. And then we're going to move into TypeScript, and it's also going to transpile everything, right? So at least you're used to transpiling. And you're going to say, well, why do I have to do this? Do I really have to transpile? Can I just not write things in Java and vanilla JS? Yes, you can. But more and more people are not. And I was reading a document, kind of an article about the founder of Node.js, and he was talking about how he loves TypeScript and how he's going to rewrite his entire Node.js platform, or he's already started doing that with TypeScript. And TypeScript, of course, is just a superset of JavaScript that is used by Google and Microsoft to create AngularJS, and so on. AngularJS is a front-end framework to make JavaScript easier, give you superpowers, all that kind of stuff. But that's really what it is. So it's kind of a really popular way of doing things nowadays. So on that, just from a lecture perspective, just to know, we haven't talked about that too much. But again, two popular front-end frameworks are Angular, right, which you should know about. This a front-end framework, and what it does is it makes it so that it creates something called single-page applications, and it uses this two-way data binding, to kind of to connect your front end with your back end. And I'm not going to go too much more in detail about that, but basically AngularJS, or Angular, so it's what it's called right now, uses TypeScript, by default. This is the default way of doing it. And if you look at the documentation, it actually goes into that. It can say tutorial. If you look at the tutorial, and there, I'm just pointing it out so you can see that. Not that I want you to learn this right now by any means, but it tells you how to set things up with the tutorial, what you're creating, and so on. And one of the things that it talks about is how to install Angular, and of course you're using TypeScript. And it talks about that. There's two ways of doing it, with TypeScript and without. And they highly recommend TypeScript. And TypeScript is a .ts extension, which we've already been using. If you look at the inside of our node modules under types, we're using the index.d.ts. That TS extension is TypeScript. And that's what gives us our type definitions for our content namespace, right? So Visual Studio Code understands TypeScript, and so that's why we were able to get code hinting inside Visual Studio Code to help us write our JavaScript better. That's all it's doing. All right. So that's one front end, and the other one that's a framework, and there's also a component-based system called React. So if I look at React.js, again from the folks at Facebook, they're the people that use this more. So React is really just a front end, and what it does is it uses Babel extensively because they have their own little shorthand called JSX. And so it converts JSX into proper JavaScript. And of course, to do that, you need Babel, right? So you're going to use React, you need Babel. You're going to use Angular, you need TypeScript, right? So either way, you're transpiling from one language to the other, right? And those two frameworks, guys and girls, are the two top frameworks in the world, right? So, and I don't know which one's first. I don't know if React is more popular nowadays or Angular. Both are very, very cool. Maybe React's not really a framework, but the two most modern front ends that you can use, okay? One is a library, the other one's a framework. All right, so that's React and Angular. And of course, we talked about TypeScript, typescriptlang.org, and I've taken you there before. But TypeScript is it's another language. And again, it's a superset of JavaScript. And what it does is it includes all the most modern options and components that are going to be included one day in JavaScript. TypeScript includes them all, or as many as possible. And it continuously evolves, and the documentation is quite extensive. They also have a playground similar to Babel REPL that we talked about. And the playground, again, if I was going to write it, so here's an example of the playground in TypeScript, and we've done this before. If I create something called namespace, and if I create, watch on the right, if I create something called, my namespace is called content, let's write that, right? And inside the content namespace on the right, you see nothing yet because I have nothing in my namespace. And if I create my function, a function in my namespace as an example that I want to write called, home content, just like we've done, home content. Here's my home content function. And you can see that what it's doing is it creates an IFI just exactly like the way we've done it, right? So this is kind of, this is TypeScript, and this would be, well, actually, we've used this exact thing other than the keyword namespace, which is the modern way of doing it, right? It just does it. This is the older way of doing it, and it's cross-compatible, works across every browser, right? So you can always come here to the playground and experiment with new features, and then what they look like in modern JavaScript or older JavaScript, right? More compatible JavaScript. Notice that I haven't really, in this particular case, because content is the namespace, and my function, as an example, is not something that I'm sharing, not exporting this function, right, then it's locked into my IFI. My IFI does not include this function called home content in any way, right? Just putting it out there for you. So if I want my home content to be exposed outside of the namespace or in the namespace or included in the namespace, I have to use the export keyword, right? So the export keyword in modern JavaScript, TypeScript, what it does this, which we've seen over and over again, this pattern, right? I'm putting this out there to you so that way, if you can't remember how to do it this way, you can always do it this way, right? And it'll just kind of transpile it for you, right? So really, really cool. And the same thing with class syntax you're going to get into. So let's say, example, instead of a function, we have a class. So here's the class syntax. So we'll say export class person. And you can see that I can declare a constructor. I want you to look at the syntax. Who's going to hit it next half of semester. And I'm going to have two objects. I'm going to have a name and an age. I can also declare on TypeScript the types, which we'll get to. Name, which is a string, and I can make it so that it is private. And I also can declare something that you've seen before, right? And age, which is a number. And then what I can also say is that the requirement for the constructor is a string, and the requirement for age is a number. I can also set up defaults for them in the constructor syntax. I can say that the default for the constructor is something like this, right? So optionals. And don't worry if you don't understand all this kind of stuff. You don't need to right now. I'm just showing you the difference between one and the other, and how much extra work is involved in classic ECMAScript 5 JavaScript. Is equal to name, and this dot underscore age is equal to age. And you can see that it transpiles as I go on the fly, right? This syntax, perfectly legal across all browsers. Most browsers, 94.5% or whatever it is, right? Or 99.45%. So I think this is okay. So you can always try, if you want to try and do something with a class or whatever, you can always come over here and then it'll transpile into a neat thing that you can use in anywhere you want. And if you don't remember how to do it, again, this is not a bad way of doing it. But you can see here that we did exactly the same thing. It created a person object, and then we connected the person object to the content namespace, and now it's outside. It's roaming free, right? Further than that, you guys have been learning about inheritance, right? So here's an example of inheritance in using TypeScript. We'll talk about inheritance later on. But you can also export another class called students. This is a classical example, which extends the person class. And what it does on the top, is it creates an idea of what classical inheritance would look like. And it creates this extends utility function. That's what it does. Or helper function, if you will. Convenience function. That's what this whole thing is, which allows us to extend one class and create another one. So if I say in my constructor, for a student, I need the same constructor as this one. Let's just copy paste for a second. I need this constructor, but I also need to pass in to my super constructor, right? I need to pass in name and age, and I don't need to do this anymore because I've already done it. But maybe my student is also going to have a student ID. So here's my student ID, which is maybe a string, which we're going to make it, string, which is going to equal to some empty value for now. And we can say that for students, they also have an extra member variable called example student ID. I'm using the underscore just to denote private, by the way. It's just a convention. You can call it whatever you like. And I can say that this underscore student is equal to students. And I've kind of done that. And furthermore than this, oops, I'm saving. Furthermore than this, you can also declare function syntax, which we'll go into later on, or methods. It says hello is the classic one, where it returns void, and it's also public. And the says hello will do a console log. We're going to use the backtick syntax here. We're going to talk about that today. Where I want to say something like this dot underscore name. It says hello, right? And then in my public studies method, I can say that console log, let's grab this thing here just to end this example, because I don't really want to go into too much detail. This is just for you, just to understand at a very high level. And notice that the name, this.name, isn't found because I made it private, this.name, but if I can also turn this to protected, or I can create other kind of syntax, which is what you should do. So I can make it from private, but the three ones are public, private, protected, which you guys should all know about right now by taking stuff. So instead of this studies, instead of says hello, we'll say is studying, right? And then you can see the JavaScript on the right to do all that. This is nice and easy. This, not so easy, right? And this is what we're going to be learning. We're going to learn stuff. We're going to be learning the stuff on the right coming up next half semester, right? Yeah, so that's all the new syntax we have to learn, but this is so much easier, right? And TypeScript compiles, transpiles everything from one to the other. And as a further example to this, outside of the namespace, I can say something like, let, my person is equal to a new objects, sorry, what did I call it? Content.person. And that tells you what I need. It tells me I need a string and an age, and they're optional. That's why it has a question mark next to it. So I can say Tom, and it's 45. Not true. Accurate. And then person dot says hello, right? We'll do that function, right? So person dot says hello, and then further down you can see it's the same. It just converts it to a var instead of a let, right? You're looking at it going, whoa, that's so much work to do, and I did it in 2 seconds, and you're like, whoa, that's so much to know. It's not so much to know. It's just basic syntax. But notice what it did. It also converted my new modern way of doing things, which we're going to be talking about today, into the older way, which is this .name plus this concatenation way of console logging. This is the new way, and we're going to be using that today. Okay, so, wow, lots of stuff that I talked about right now. But really where it came from was this idea that Babel transpiles from older JS, or sorry, from new JS to old JS, right? And if you think about new and old, right? And same thing with TypeScript, even newer JS to old JS, right? Or the more current JS, if you will. So I mean, we're going to be using TypeScript eventually. We're going to get there, not now, but I wanted to give you kind of a hint of where we're going with it. And think about this: if I put this inside of a of a file, I can have my own namespace, and I can have several classes that I declare later on, and I can access them in another file. And we do that to build up enterprise-level applications. Okay. All right, cool. So I'm just going to kill all that stuff. However, we do need this part. And inside of our application, I want to include Babel today. So I'm going to go into my command prompt in my application. Then I'll put it up on GitHub in a second. But the way you do it is, again, I want to add those packages, the Babel packages. So if I go npm install, right? And if you notice what it says here, it says babel-preset-env -save -dev. I can just take this whole thing, but I'll type it babel-preset-env, and it's -save -dev. And what this says is this part, whenever we have -save -dev, it means we're going to list it in our package.json file, in this manifest file, as a dev dependency. Sorry, a development dependency, not a project dependency. Project dependency means you can't live without it. If you don't have this in your project will fail, right? Dev dependency, again, means nice to have, not necessary. It's good for development, but nothing else. And that's what Babel allows us to do. So if I press enter, you can see now that it's going to go out, grab that new package, and put it into the dev dependencies section of our package.json file. And we're done. Cool. And I'm just going to close this off because I have it open, and that's why it's not updating. So you can see now that there it is. All right, so that's one. So I need that one. It also talks about I need this .babelrc file, which I recommend. So I'm going to go down here, and I'm going to put a dot, start with .babelrc file. And notice that it's recognized in my Visual Studio Code. It recognizes as a Babel file, right? And the RC file, like it says, just needs this presets env. If I start typing, if I press Control Space in Visual Studio Code, you can see that it has a lot of stuff for Babel already. If I put presets in there, it'll remember what it is. And of course, env is what I want to put in there. So presets environment, that's what it is. Okay, so that's that part. And that's the first thing I want you to do. And the next part for Babel is this CLI part, which is Babel-CLI. That's what we want to do, definitely use here, right? So, and notice it'll also be included in our dev dependencies, right? So again, I'm just going to do the same thing. So I'm going to say npm install Babel-CLI minus save minus dev. Okay. And then it's going to include Babel CLI as part of our dev dependencies for our project. And what this really does, just to give you guys to understand, so you see it all, right, is you see inside of node modules now, right, we have, and if I just refresh, there are a ton of more modules that it's included, yeah? A ton, right? Because it needs to support Babel. Babel transpiles one language to another language. So that's quite challenging to do. And so there's lots of little things like Babel polyfill and so on, a bunch of other stuff in here that allows us to do things. So that's one. How do I use Babel, though? So if I go Babel and I press Enter, it kind of says it's not recognized the name of the commandlet, function, script file, or whatever. Doesn't understand what that is, right? So if I go Babel, you know, as an example, -CLI and I press Enter, again, nothing really comes to mind. It doesn't work. All right, so that we're not there yet. But this is where we want to get to. We want to get to the point where Babel CLI is what we want to use, or Babel. Notice that this is the usage. So we say, so here's our Babel CLI. We put this thing where it says Babel and then the source and so on, -d lib, right? So that's where we want it. That's how we want to use it, Babel CLI, right? Okay, and this is going to be inside of our dev dependencies inside of our scripts. We can make a scripts part, this part right here, inside of our package.json file, and then it should work, right? So if I take this part under scripts, and if I go to my package.json file, it won't work, by the way. But if you go to package.json, and inside package.json, you see that there's lots of stuff. We already have a scripts part. It's called test, but we never use tests, right? We're just going to replace this scripts with this, the one we got from, we don't need these pluses, the one we got from online there for Babel. Notice it says build. I'm going to save. And if I say something like, if I do something like build now, if I press build, right? Now it says source. There is no source, right? Where do I have all my Babel scripts, all my JavaScript? It's inside scripts. So this has got to change from source scripts, right? And if I go down here and press build, we should expect it to work, but it doesn't. The way to make it work, let's clear this out for you guys. We'll put npm install Babel-CLI -g. What that'll do is it'll install the Babel command line interface, that's what CLI stands for, on the interface, on the command line. So you can use it in any terminal window or in your command prompt. So now if I type in Babel, right, it'll say, hey, wait a minute, what do you want? Right? Didn't give me an error anymore. And if I type build, because I made this build script inside of my project, right? And if I press enter, it'll say, the term build is not recognized because I'm inside of this project, right? And it doesn't know what this is. But what if I just type this, build scripts -d lib? Let's type this. And by the way, it's not that difficult to do. But if I go npm build, right? It says npm build doesn't work, right? If I go, I'm just going to point this out to you guys so you can see this. If I go just build by itself, it should work, but it doesn't. What if I just type in what it says? Babel scripts -d, and then it says lib. minus D lib. Lib is where it's going to put the new script. There is no lib folder, right? So instead of lib, let's put dist as in our distribution folder. All right, so we don't have a dist folder right now, but I want to put that in dist. So I put minus D dist, and if I press enter, if I did everything right, it creates a dist folder for me, right? And under my dist folder, I have compatible versions of my home.js, contact.js, app.js, and about.js that are compatible with all versions of browsers out there. So if I look at it now, you can see that there's not a lot of changes, right? Except for the vars. All the var keyword, all the lets have been turned to vars, right? And anything else that's not compatible, notice it says use strict everywhere, right? So anything else that I've changed that's not going to work or whatever properly, it will change. Again, not a lot of differences from one way of doing it to the other. Notice we haven't gone through a lot of changes. But here's an example of our distribution folder, our dist folder, has all the distribution versions of our files that are cross-compatible. Okay, that's why I've done this. Okay, do I expect you to remember this? Do I expect you to do anything with it yet? Hell no, right? But I want you to know about it. I want you to know that Babel is kind of an interface we use to transpile from new JS into older JS, right? Not much older, by the way. Yeah, I tried, but it didn't work. But if you notice that, so in my package.json, I'm going to save this. And if I type build, how it should work is it should detect my so it should detect that what I'm using here locally, but it doesn't know what that build script is, and because the way I've set up my project, it's not anyone else's problem, it's my own. Okay, but however, just to point this out, that if I look at my npm version, by the way, for -v, my npm version is 6.1. That's the one I'm using. And for those people who are watching, and as this recording, my node version is 10.1. All right, so that's the node version I'm using right now. All right, so again, that's what this dist folder does. But imagine I had to do this every single time. So every single time I want to have this new compatible script work, I got to transpile, and I got to do it by hand. Like I got to go in here on my command line and then type in this command, right, which is Babel scripts -d dist every single time. If I did it again, right, it'll take whatever scripts it'll do and pop, it'll put them in there again. It'll overwrite the scripts that are already there, and I'd have to do that over and over again. So that's a real pain, right? We don't want that to happen. And so we have something called builders out there and packages, all right? And one of the ones we're going to be using this semester is going to be called Gulp, Gulp.js. So what Gulp.js does, and again, it's a little bit older. The new one is Webpack, but I want you to learn at least one of the older ones first before we do Webpack. So you would install some of these commands. You can see that there's Gulp CLI and so on. And then what it does, it creates another file for you, and then you can create something called a watch task. So when something changes, it automatically transpiles from using Babel from new JS to old JS. So you don't have to type it in every single time. Babel, -d, and so on. We're not going to be there yet. I'm not expecting you to do this right now. I'm just introducing it to you because Gulp.js is something that we're going to be using later in semester, 100%. Right, so just I'll put it in there. I think I might have put it in there already, but I'll put it in there one more time. All right, so why all this stuff? Why am I talking about it? Because we're going to use Babel a little bit today, and I'll explain why. So I've installed Babel. Everything's been installed. And one of the things that we've been doing up to date is using this old syntax. So I'll use the dist folder as the newer distribution files. And if I wanted my index.html to hook into it, instead of going to scripts, home, scripts, I can go into dist. I would just rename these. I would just kind of redirect my scripts to use the dist folder, my distribution folder, as opposed to my scripts folder. My scripts folder could be my scripts, just for me, for development purposes, right? And then I'll have a distribution folder where I have the files I'm going to distribute with the app, okay? So I write them in my regular way, and then I use Babel to transpile them and place them inside my dist folder. That's the process, one way or the other. All right. For now, though, let's not do that yet. We can look at our dist folder to see what the differences are, but I don't expect you to link to it in any way. Okay. But one thing to note is up until today, we've been using the older version of the kind of syntax that we use for dropping in variables and so on, right? So example would be, I'm just going to see if there's an example of where I'm kind of posting some stuff, maybe in the app.js file. Yeah, so here's an example. So here's my console log error, and typically when I want to concatenate or interpolate my variable inside of a console.log, I usually put the plus sign, right? So let's do it in our contact form because today's form day anyway, right? So here's our contact form. And in our contact form, you can see that I'm adding a cancel button to the forms. And what I want to do is, is kind of, show the value of what's in my form later on, right? Which is what I want to talk about. And I want to do a console log to kind of show in the bottom of my form all the stuff that I've typed into my form. Well, if you notice inside of my contact form, I have a bunch of different elements, form elements. I have, as an example, as we go down, here's my form. In my card body, I have a form element. Here's my form element. Inside there, I have several elements: full name, contact number, email, and message. Those are different elements that I have in there with labels and inputs. This is just HTML. And what I want to do is I want to take the values, right, that I have from my form. By the way, this is for your assignment number 2, right? I want to take the values of my form elements here, full name, contact number, and so on, and I want to output them to the console, right? So I want to do that. I know that typically what's going to happen is on submit, my form is going to try and submit the document, right? So if I was going to actually go to my form, I'm going to write this. I'm going to run light server for a second. Here's my light server, and if I go to my contact page, and if I click on send, it's going to try and validate. So it's going to try and do. And if I did that, if I put in my name and my contact number, by the way, it's not validating right now, and my email address, and some message, and click send, it's going to be gone, right? Because I'm redirecting. That's what I've chosen to do. That's from assignment number 1. That's what I asked you to do, right? And so if you look at the contact.js page, it tells you that. It says, hey, look, I've got my form. And in this particular case, I'm just creating an element called this new cancel button that I made, right, on the fly with JavaScript, right? And but somewhere along the lines, I've created this ability. So when I click on the button, so here's my add event listener, right? And when I click on the submit button or my cancel button, right, I want to prevent my defaults, because right now what is happening right now, right? When I kind of click on my submit button, something else is happening. It's going to my first form, right? Not my form, but it's going to my index.html. That's what's happening with my when my cancel button is being clicked. Okay, my cancel button. But what about if I want to do the same thing with my submit button? So remember we talked about last week when we used prevent default, it prevents the default behavior for the form. So it doesn't redirect it somewhere else, all right? So that's what I want to do, right? I want to be able to, kind of prevent my default functionality, because normally if you look at my contact.html page, here's my contact.html page, there's nothing in it that tells me what to do, right? It doesn't say, hey, go to the next page or go to that form page. So how does it know what to do, right? It just tells me that everything is required, right? But if I don't want it to go anywhere, if I want to prevent my default behavior, I have to somehow hook into my button, this button called with a type of submit, right? And there's different ways I can do that. I can find it according to its class, right? Or if I query the button, it's probably the only button on my form right now, right? I could say, query, you know, instead of query selector all, I want to say query selector button, right? And that'll be my send button, right? But the nicer way to do it, of course, is every time you make a button, you create an ID for the button and you call it what it is. So in this case, it's the send button. And again, you can make it send button or send button according to your convention, whatever it is. I'm going to make it capitals, right, for me. So there's my send button. I've modified the HTML. So now in my HTML for my contact form, there's the button has an ID of send button. And now that I can do that, I can hook into it, just like I've done before. I can, instead of trying to find which button it is and so on, I mean, it's pretty much a lot easier to do that, right? So my cancel button connects to my new cancel button that I've written, all right? That's what this does. But now I want to make another event handler, an event listener, event handler, just for my submit button. And this is the stuff that I did last time with my push state and so on. I'm just going to remove that for today, right? Because that was just examples of how to do changing my navigation. We talked about the history object and the location object and so on. I'm just going to get rid of that today just so we don't dilute what I'm trying to talk about. But further down, I want to do the same thing. I want to say that so let, and we're going to talk about my button, which is the submit button, is equal to document.getElement by ID, call it submit button. Did I call it submit button or send button? I can't remember. I'll know that in a second anyway, because let's check. Oops. So if I go back to my contact, I think I called it send button. Yeah. So let's go back and change that. Here's my send button instead of submit button, send button. So it changes to send button just to make it so it's the same. Although I can call it whatever I want. All right, so good. So I've got my send button. I've hooked into it. This is the button itself. And now I want to create an event handler or a listener. So I say send button dot add event listener. And on click, this is the event I want to listen for, if I can type anything today. And then I want to do an inline function. The traditional way of doing an inline function is like this, right? This is the old way. But now we're going to use the new way. And here's ECMAScript 6 way of doing it. It uses something called fat arrow functions. Okay, so this is the new way of doing an inline function with JavaScript. Okay, remember we talked about compatibility? This, my friends, not always compatible. Arrow functions, right? And if I look back at can I use for a second, so let's go to can I use, and if I put arrow, right? So arrow functions, you can see that for the most part, it's 87% compatible, so it's going to work in my browser right now, right? But some older browsers like IE and Opera Mini and some other ones will not be compatible with this new one, right? So that's why we're going to transpile from using Babel, right? Okay, just to show you this. So this is okay. So this syntax here is the same as this syntax here that I've used, function, event, whatever. And I can pass in the event object just like normal. So this is my parameter, right? The fat arrow says, hey, guess what? If I hover over it, it tells you what it does. It says, now it's a little bit different. One of the things that it does do is it also keeps this context when you use fat arrow functions, all right? So if I say something like event.prevent default, what I'm saying is, hey, when I click the send button, don't take me anywhere. Just sit there, which is what I want to do in my assignment number 2. Okay? So how does this work? So if I go back to here, my COMP125, and if I go back to my contact page, and if I enter my data again, so Tom and my contact number, and my email address, my message, and click send, nothing happens because we prevented the default behavior, right? Right now, my cancel button does something. If I click the cancel button, it'll take me back here, right? Because that's what I've programmed it to do, right? So prevent default is a very important thing to understand, guys and girls, right? Because prevent default, what it does is it stops the default behavior of an event from triggering, All right, so my default event when I have my submit button is submitting my form. I don't want that to happen, right? And in assignment 2, I don't want it to happen. For next week's test, I don't want it to happen. I need to use prevent default. I'm telling you this is going to be on your test next week, right? So you need to understand and remember how to use this, right? So first I want to do this. And the next thing is I want to output this stuff to the console, right? So one of the things I want to do is I want to output my form data to the console. So maybe I want to make a new function to do that. So in my function, you know, I call a new function that's output form data to console. I'll make a big, real long function name, okay? There's my function. And it says output form data to the console. Notice that it's grayed out. This is a new thing, new feature in Visual Studio Code, wherein when we don't use a particular function, as an example, if we don't use it, then it's not available. It's not available. Like we haven't used it, so it's grayed out. It's just kind of showing us almost like a warning, this function is not used, right? And so far, we haven't really used it or called it in any way, right? Also, notice that if I don't attach it to my content, it's a private function that's only available inside of this particular file, inside my contact.js file, right? If I don't attach it to my content, right? And should I attach it to my content? No, right? It's only for the content page, right? Or my contact page, right? So therefore, I don't need it in any other page, and so I don't want to include it in my content namespace, right? I only want to include in my content namespace stuff I'm going to call outside of my namespace, right? For example, in my app.js, I called my content, contact, content, content, about content, content, home content. These things I want to call. But there's some other functions that are inside of these files that are private or local to the file itself. And one of these is going to be this output form data to console function. So what is this going to do? It's going to hook into the form data, right? Okay, how do I hook into the form data? Well, if I go back to my contact.html page, you can see that the form data has a couple of things that I can hook into. One, if you notice, I can hook into the ID. Each of the form controls has an ID, so I can do that. I can also hook into it through name, right? Get elements by name, right? So I can do that by name. So ID or name I can hook into, right? Yes? Is that a hand? No? All right. So if I want to get my full name, I can hook into it with the ID full name. So I can just do the same thing. I can just say in my contact.js, I can say that let full name is equal to get element by ID full name. I could do it this way, okay? And if you notice, if you notice in my contact page, let's just put it side by side so you can see it. So in Visual Studio Code, you can use this split editor function, right? So I can look at my contact page on this side and my contact.js on the left side. I don't need this right now, so I can just minify it or collapse it over here. So this is what I'm looking at. You can see that the full name on the right. Now, if I had a bigger monitor, this would be really awesome. I don't, right? But you can see the full name is what I'm hooking into with this get element by ID. Get element by ID hooking into the full name. And then what I'm doing is I'm going to do something. Notice now that full name is also grayed out because I've never used it. So I want to let's say I want to output this, right? So I want to say console.log, you know, as an example, and I want to output my full name. So I can say full name. This is the old way of doing it. Full name plus the concatenation, right? Full name. And notice now that it lights up. Full name now becomes blue instead of gray. That's the new feature of Visual Studio Code. It tells me that I'm using my variable. But however, output form data to console is another way I know that it's never been used. I've never called it. And I want to call it output data to console, right? Down here, after I click my send button, I want to do that output form data to console. I want to call that now. And when I call it here, now it's yellow. Again, new feature of Visual Studio Code. So it tells me I'm using the form finally. So what it's going to do is when I click the button, it's going to output my full name, right? As an example, this is full name the element. That's going to give me the whole element full name. But let's do that for now, and then we'll see what it gives me, okay? It's not accurate. This is not what I want. I want actually the value of the full name. All right, so we'll see how to do that. Again, this is back to DOM manipulation, because we're going to hit DOM manipulation the entire semester. All right, so cool. I'm here. I go to my contact page and type in my simple contact information. I'm not even going to validate that. And my email address, I'm not going to validate that. This is all about validation. It validates. I can put any value in there, and it's okay. And that's wrong. So today and tomorrow, we're going to talk about how to handle this, how to stop, really bad data like this from going into my form, right? And we'll also talk about best practices for form validation. But I want to tell you this. I want to start by talking about this. If I was ever going to ask you what's the best way of form validation, I think we might have talked about it already, is you need to do it twice. Once in the front end and once in the back end. Because I can always turn off JavaScript on the front end, right? And then there's no form validation anymore, right? However, if I do turn off JavaScript, then you won't have, maybe the form won't function anymore. But if you turn off JavaScript validation, or on the form itself, you put no validate, the form validation, then it doesn't matter. I can send anything I want. So here's hello. But you notice I have Tom. And if I click send, right, nothing happens here physically. But if I go to my console, I have this. I have that get element by ID. It says reference error at output from data to console. I said get element by ID. I'm so smart. I didn't put document in front of it. I mean it in a very sarcastic way. Document.get element by ID. Okay, that's good. That's a good error. And I said, okay, cool. And now it redid this, of course. So let's put in some garbage data, right? And it'll take it because I'm not validating right now. And it says form name object. That's not good, right? So I don't want that. So what do I need to get the full name? Well, full name, if you look at it, if I put dot, has, it's an element, right? Full name is an element. So if you scroll down, or scroll up in this case, you can see that the element itself has a bunch of stuff, right? And if I look at what do I really want? The element itself has a value, right? So name is really the value of my object, right? So so can I put value? That's the node value? It says node value. And if I hover over node value, right, as an example, it says string. Is that good? Full name node value. Would that give me what I want? So again, Tom. And then no, the node value doesn't have anything. That's not it. So what would it be? Come on, help me out here. It can't be inner HTML, because inner HTML, right? If I go full name, because full name represents the whole input, right? So if I go value, that doesn't work. So what else? What could it be? Well, if you look at if you go back up to, you're going to run into this problem when you do your assignment number 1, assignment number 2. So I want to find, form element value, right? JavaScript. I type it in. It's going to take me to W3 Schools. And it says, look, JavaScript to Stack Overflow 2 is not a bad place. Getting HTML form values, right? So how do we do that? If I scroll through, it says, here's my input. And notice I have my name. And in my JavaScript, I'm saying variable name is document.getElement by ID, whatever the unique ID is, just like we've done. Here's my unique ID. And then it says dot value. Wait a minute. What? I can't do that. It doesn't allow me to put value in there, right? Notice my value is equal to value here. I've already set the value up. But if I put value in there anyway, right? So I don't listen to this, and I put value in there. I press save, and I go back up to here. And if I don't listen to what it says, and I just type in some stuff and click send, then I get my name is Tom. So value, the name, the keyword value is part of the each of the form elements, the inputs. It takes the value of all those things, right? Of all my elements in the form. And actually, if I wanted to get the form value, so if, let's say, for example, here in my little console, I have a console that's open right here. You can do the same thing, right? I can do something like, well, document.getElement by ID, right? and I can look at the form. If I say the next element that I want to look at on my form is my contact number. So here's my contact number. Here's my contact number, and then value. If I press enter, you'll see that I got that, right? Here it is, right? So that's the way to do it. You can do it all in one like this as well. So that's what I want to do. But this is the old way of doing it. And I'm not interpolating here in my console log, right? I'm concatenating strings because the value that I'm getting back from my full name, right? This object here, which is actually an HTML element. This value object is actually a string. Anything you get back from a form is a string. If you want to do calculations from the form, you got to convert it from a string into a number, and then do calculations, then convert it back. If you want to do something else, all right? If you want to output something to the console or out to the form again, right? So notice that this is a string, and I'm taking these two strings, this one, and concatenating them together to create a new string that shows the new value. But actually, even if this wasn't a string, if this was just a number, for example, instead of putting it this way, if I said +5, right? That's a number literal, right? And if I was to do the same thing, so if I say Tom and some gobbledygook there for now, and I click send, you can see I'm getting 5. So it doesn't matter what you concatenate. If you add a value on a literal, or if you add a string like this, it's the same result. But this is the old way of doing it, right? And the new way of doing it, well, it's going to comment this out. The new way of doing it is like this, console.log. And instead of using quotations, we use something called backtick. The backtick is located on just underneath your escape key on your keyboard. Take a look, all right? It's underneath the tilde. There's the tilde, which looks like a little symbol like this. This is the tilde, right? And the backtick is underneath the tilde. If you press backtick, you can see that in Visual Studio Code, it produces that backtick. It looks like there's a little slash going from the top left to the bottom right. That's a backtick. Again, this is the new ECMAScript 6 standard and on, beyond ECMAScript 6. So backtick actually allows me to cross different lines as well. I can actually cross different lines, right? But the real feature is I can use the $sign and my curly braces. And what I can do is I can actually inject a variable in here, full name, right? So console.log full name, right? And what I can do is I can put in this part first, just like normal. So I can kind of say, hey, this is my first part. And instead of doing it this way, this is the new way with ECMAScript 6, right? So I'm using backtick character, and I'm using interpolation syntax to put it in. By the way, very similar to the new interpolation rules for C#, right? You should have seen that already. Does that make sense? So full name is now going to inject this, right? This HTML element. However, just to point this out to you, full name.value is what I really want, not full name, right? Okay, but what would this look like when I transpile? Like, as an example, because this might be compatible. And if I go back to can I use, right, as an example, and I say, backtick, right? Can I use backtick or interpolation? Template literals, template strings, which is what it is, right? They're called template literals, which I'm actually injecting. I'm creating a template, so we're calling them, right? Again, 89.27%, kind of compatibility, but not compatible with IE and not compatible with Opera Mini, right? Okay, cool. So there's a case for transpiling, and if I was going to transpile, so let's just open up another little window down here. And if I want to transpile, then I could do that Babel stuff, right? I can kind of go in here, and I can go Babel scripts -D, right? And then I'm going to put it in the dist folder. So it's going to go in there, transpile all this stuff, and I really want to look at this contact.js. I can actually click on it here, and if I just control click, you can see that it opens it up, and you can see what it's done, right? It actually converted, right? This is in the dist folder. This is in my scripts folder. So I can actually bring it into its own. I can bring this into its own editor window. So here's my comparison. All right, so here's my original one, right, where I interpolated using this method. And then here's what Babel does for me. Babel converts it back. So it's more compatible. And notice it also did some other work for me. It also changed my let to a var. Right? That's all the Babel does. Babel just converts from new JS to old JS. So it's more compatible across all systems. Okay? Again, I'm not using this yet. I'm just showing you so you can see what it does, right? Again, I want you to learn this new syntax because this is the new syntax. When we create a template and I want to inject stuff into my template, I can make whatever template I want, even HTML templates. No, this is built in, and 89% of browsers will support it right now, like we saw. All right, so this is the way I want to do it. So that's the full name, and let's get the other ones. So I want to say let's contact number is the next one. We can finish this one. Oh. And how did I know how to get that? Because on the right-hand side, it shows contact number with my ID as contact number. Actually, I should just look at this and I can see what it is. Let's get the other ones. Notice it's not being used because it's grayed out, right? Email address. Again, this is, you can make your own, your variable naming might be different than mine. As long as you're not using A, B's, and C's, I'm happy. That doesn't make any sense. Okay, email address. And then there's message, right? So those are the four I'm looking for. So here's message is equal to documents, dot element by ID. So I've kind of hooked into all of them. What the heck? Hooked into all of them. And now I want to do this every single time. So I want to kind of console log. Instead of full name, it's going to be contact number. Let's make our little thing, contact number. And let's make it look nice on the console. Do that. So full name, contact number, email address. And message. And then your message. Okay. And now this is different. It can't be full name. It's got to be contact number here, and it'll detect it. And email address and message. Now I'm using the values here. I could have put them up here, right? When I get element by ID, I could have made this thing right here, they're all values as opposed to doing it here, but I find that I can do other things now with these as opposed to just getting the values. And maybe I want to decorate it a little bit, so I can do a console log, right? And I want to put, using the backtick again, I can put some kind of, I don't know, decorator for the values just to make it look nice on the console, right? And maybe I can put in, form data, so console log, and then I can use the percent, what we did before, which is the percent C for CSS, right? We can say something like, form data, and I can add some CSS as an optional parameter in the console log like we did last week, which was font-weight. This is just CSS, which is bold. Again, we'll bold it, and we can also add other things in here. Font-size. Instead of making it 20, we'll make it something like 16. 16 pixels, and then we'll end that off. So kind of create our own little thing. Now, they don't recommend doing too much of this stuff, but it just makes it look nicer in the console when I'm outputting it, right? All right, back to the stuff that we're going to do here. So let's go back to this and type it in again. So Tom, my contact number, gobbledygook. We don't care right now. And let's see what happens, right? So there's my stuff, and it comes out. Here's my form data, right? And then there's my stuff. And if I really want to, maybe just for completeness, maybe I want my form data to be kind of enclosed in this. I want to kind of put this up there. If I want to make this all come out in blue, the easiest way to do that is to make it, instead of log, turn this all into infos, right? So again, I kind of do one of these. If I press Shift Alt, and if I type in info, You can see that Visual Studio Code allows me to do more than one line editing, right? So I can kind of save that. And if I go back to here, or it didn't work. Did I save it? Sorry? Yeah, info should be blue, but it didn't work this time. There's also warn. There's a bunch of other ones I can put in here, right? Sorry? What? Oh, select all of them is Shift Alt, and if you hold Shift and Alt together, and then if I just select the parts I want. So again, I start with my cursor in a particular place, Shift Alt, then I can just select the part I want to change. If I want to move this back to log or warn, I can change this to warnings. So Tom, and we don't care about this right now. We're not validating. And you can see now that it's all yellow, right? With a little bit of warnings in there. Lots of stuff you can do. But the idea is that I'm outputting. This takes care of most of what you need for assignment number 2. All right? That's what I'm asking you to do, pretty much. Let's move this back to log, right? Okay, so I want to change my color value. I want to change my color value of my form data. I can do that too. It's just color, right? Color dash, and then it should accept something like, I don't know, red. And if it doesn't, we can put in a color value, right? So again, if I go Tom, pretty much any CSS stuff will work, right? You can see that that works too. I can make whatever color I want in there, and I can even add that stuff in. Now here's something. If I put, notice I use quotations here, and here I use backtick, right? So here's backtick. So I'm not going to do it with these ones, but let's use %C here. So if I say %C, and then I put some kind of value at the other end. So I kind of do the same thing if I said something like, you know, color red. This is an example. And again, I'm just going to go in there, type in some stuff. You can see this time form data worked, and so did this piece. This piece worked. The rest stayed the regular color. So my %C rules, which %C indicates to the console that I'm actually using CSS in the console. That's what I'm doing, to format my console warnings the way I want. And now you might like, why would I care about that? Why do I care what the console look like? Well, imagine if you have a bunch of output, like lots and lots of it, and you want to kind of give indications that things are good or things are bad. You can do that with green and reds. You can do that with different colors. Again, it just helps you parse out some of your debugging to do that. So again, if I was to use the same kind of stuff, so let's say I do one of these, Control C, I want to put that in front of all my stuff, right? And let's say I want to make, instead of color red, I want to make everything blue because maybe I like blue better. So I'll say blue in there. Remember the standard colors, blue, turquoise, a bunch of other colors, cyan. A lot of them are recognized, right, by default. There's nothing for you to really do. Just put in the color that you want. Yellow, red, all those colors are, you don't have to think about the hex codes or understand the hex codes in any way, right? Yeah, yeah, because this one is the old way of doing it, right, with double quotes. Again, I'm using the C, or I can just go and put backtick in there, right? Places by backtick. Oops, this one. And it'll work. Okay, so if I go back in here and go, I want everything to be blue. Okay. Again, why would I do something like that? Oh, that's weird. What did I do? Color blue. Oh, yeah, I forgot the %C. So without the %C, it interprets it as something I want to put out to the console, right? So that's one thing it does. All right, questions around outputting your form data, because this is important, guys, for your assignment number 2, as well as for your tests next week. You need to know how to do this. So 2 steps. What I did was down in here when I created my my function, right? Again, this is the new arrow function. And by the way, what did it do with the arrow function? Because the arrow function is also a newer piece of JS, right? what did it do with my my distribution version of my contact form? So let's take a look at that for a second. So down in here, I used a function with add event listener, right? And you can see now it went to the old way. This is the old syntax, older syntax, and this is the newer syntax, almost identical.
So why do you?
Event is actually I'm capturing the mouse events. That's what it is, right? So what kind of mouse events am I doing? Am I doing a mouse over, a mouse out, a mouse click? And I'm using the click event. I'm capturing the click event. And I'm saying, hey, for this event, when I do this type of event, which is the click event, I want to prevent the default behavior. That's what I'm saying. I could also use this dot, but I'm not going to do that right now. So that's the thing. So I'm just showing you that the syntax, all it's doing is converting the syntax from newer JS to older JS, right? That's what Babel does for us. Okay? Newer syntax, which is totally fine. In fact, if you think about this, I could use my newer syntax from up here too, right? I could make my ifs arrow functions, right? Like this. My ifs could turn out to be arrow functions. The new syntax is this, right? That's my new syntax for ifs. And again, if I go back down here and I do a Babel script dist, right? You can see now that, well, it's gone back. So this is the new, this is the old, right? It actually is just a little cleaner. All we do is remove the function keyword when we declare the function, right? And what it does, it just returns whatever the value of that function is, right? So kind of neat syntax. I'm using it here. I'm going to start using this syntax more. All right, you're going to start seeing me use the newer syntax. So JavaScript, when you came into this course, you're like, hey, yeah, we're learning JavaScript, the language of the web. And you're like, it's going to be easy, just like HTML5 and CSS. And now I'm telling you, yeah, but you need to know this, that. And then you're like, holy, wow, that's a lot of stuff to know about JavaScript, because JavaScript is changing, my friends. It's constantly evolving, adding stuff to it, right? And there's a lot of modern JS, ECMAScript 6, ECMAScript 2015, 2016, 2017, and newer versions of JavaScript that are coming out based on those new standards that add additional features and syntax like this, right? And so that's why it's important to know from a compatibility perspective, we need to use Babel, right? Or TypeScript in the future.
What's the significance of this equal sign?
The arrow, it's called a fat arrow function. All right, fat arrow functions, what it does two things. It doesn't just pass in the parameter, but it also passes in the context that it's in as well. So it actually passes in this context, right? Again, notice if I hover over this thing, you can see that if I hover over this part right here, this little paren over here, it tells me that the parameter is 1, and it's returning content, which is an object. That's what it's doing, right? When I hover over this. On this side, same. Full name, HTML element, that's what it tells us. And so the same thing goes here. The difference here is this is a let, and this is a var. And it says local var. If I go here, it doesn't say that. It says let full name. Here, local var, right? So different things. Why? Because let, it doesn't hoist, right? Var, it hoists, right? With the old JavaScript. We talked about that before. So there's some issues, right? But we want to put it in old script anyway, because at the end of the day, it's more compatible. All right, so some of them may argue, well, why don't you just do var anyway, right? Why don't we just use the old JS anyway? Well, because we're moving towards this. We're moving towards this syntax, so it's good to know it. All right, questions around outputting your form data. We haven't done any validation right now. We're just outputting form data because we have to capture the form data first before we validate. A couple things we're going to be talking about tomorrow. So in your PowerPoint, which is up on eCentennial right now, there are some form properties, if you will. Autocomplete is a form property. Elements length. Elements is an array or collection of all the elements in the form, right? So if I wanted to find out how many form elements there were, let's output that. I can say, so form data is so on. And if I wanted to add in more detail, let's underneath that, we can say, instead of form data, in fact, let's just put in surround this stuff with another decorator just because you want to make it look nice. And instead of just form data, we also want some, form properties. So we'll kind of cut these three things. I'm just going to get rid of this side just so that it makes it easier for us to see. So I'm going to grab this part. Again, more console log stuff. And just for space, I'm going to instead of form, say form properties, right? And under the form properties, what I want is to output a couple of form properties, right? And one of them is length, right? Which is my form, whatever my form is, length. And how do I get that? I don't have a value I haven't captured my form here, but I could do that. I actually did it down here, right? Where I said form 0 append child, right? Document form 0 is a way of finding the first form, because forms is something that's part of the document object, and form 0 means the first form or the 0th form. So I can do this. I can take form 0. I want to put that in here. And instead of dot value, I can say dot length, right? So that kind of gives me the form length. What is that? What does form length give us? Well, if I go back to here, this is important to understand, right? Because we're going to get into this tomorrow more, right? So again, I'm just going to put some stuff in here now. It doesn't matter what I put in here because we're not validating. And you can say form data is this. My form length is 6. Okay, let's count. 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Right? Well, what about these things, the labels? Right? They're not counted. Right? These aren't counted, but these are. Okay, cool. And then my form elements, right? So one of them is form elements. So if I kind of do one of these, I'll put this out.
We need to use index to access the form.
So forms, and then it's elements. Right? Elements is an actual collection. So if I just did this by itself, right? And if I did that, so put some other detail in there just to make it a little bit different and add some numbers. So you can see the difference in the elements. You can see that it has an object collection. I can't get at it right now because it just says some kind of HTML form controls collection. That's what it does, right? However, if I look at form elements 0, so the 0th element of my forms collection, right? So forms, I only have one form. Each form has an elements collection, almost like an array that's built into the form, right? That's what it does. And now if I do that, if I say, let's say 1, 2, 3, 4, and say send, you can see that my form length is 6, and my object.html input element is what I get back. So I get this, HTML input element. So if I want the value of that, I can kind of dive into that, right? I can do it this way. Same thing as doing this, but I can do it this way here, right? So the form value of the 0th element. So first form element. So we'll say the 0th form element. If I want to put that in, is, whatever it's going to be. Let's just back this up to make it look nice, right? So again, 1, 2, 3, 4. Send. You can see that the 0th form element is 1, right? So that'll be the 0th. And to test this, that means the first form element would be 2 in this case, in the particular case. If I went to 2, let's just do that. In fact, let's just run this in a loop, right? We can go through a loop. We can make a loop of those. So I can use a for each. We'll end it off with this, guys. If I go for each, I want to look at the array-like element, which is the elements array. All right. So if I want to look at the elements array, so I can say document.forms 0 elements, this part. That's the array. Right. So for each element in the elements array, we'll call it element. It makes sense to make it element in this case, right? We'll take this and put it in there. Right? And we'll say that instead of the 0th element, hey, now we can use interpolation, right? So we can say, well, actually, we don't know what the element is, right? So because we're not counting, because I'm going through each of the elements in the elements, right? I can go to for loop would have been better if I wanted to do that. So I can do that instead. So I can say something like for loop. Here's my for loop with an index, right? And then I can grab this whole thing again, put it inside here, take this part, which is this elements, or I can actually say dot length, forms dot length, right? So I can say this part dot length, right? Now let's interpolate. So for the 0th element or the first element, and we'll just say for the 0, we're not going to kind of figure this out too much. So we're going to say I want to interpolate inside there for my index. So we'll say element instead of form element. Form element, we'll say form element, whatever. Form element 0, whatever it is, with a colon. We're injecting this part, documents.forms, and then instead of forms 0, it's going to be index, right? And we're going to loop through each of the form elements this way. Okay? Nice and easy. Let's see what it does. So save. And again, we'll say 1, 2, 3, 4, send. You can see now that it did a couple things that I didn't want it to do, right? I did 1, 2, 3, 4, and then what happened here? 4 and 5 are also there, right? Because I'm going through my send and cancel buttons, and they don't have any kind of value whatsoever. But you can see that I went through 1, 2, 3, 4, right? So form length is 6, right? And I know that these 2 buttons are part of the form, so therefore they're included. And if I wanted not to have those 2 buttons come in, as an example, I could do an if statement to say if the form element that I'm getting back type is equal to button, what kind is it that I'm getting back? Because remember, I'm getting an element, an HTML element, right? That's what I'm getting back here when I go elements. HTML form element, right? And that's what I'm getting back out of my HTML form controls collection. Form controls collection is a list of all my form controls, including my buttons, right? So if I don't want to include my buttons, how do I do that? Well, if we go back to the PowerPoint for a second. So again, it tells me how many elements, the length. I can also choose not to validate. No validate, if I put that into the form, I could do that by saying at the top of the form, down in here, when the form is loaded, as an example, when I load my page, so let's say at the top of my page, I can say that, let's go to my forms. So for this form, I can say that form 0 dot no validate, right, is equal to true. It kind of set it to not validate, right? So when the form loads, I'm not validating anymore. What this does is if I go back to, if it works properly, if I go back to this form and I click send, it's going to not validate anything anymore. It's not going to use HTML validation. It turns it off, right? So that's what it does, right? That's what this does. No validate is equal to true. You can also do things like autocomplete is equal to true, right? So if I put autocomplete on, right? Now, Chrome disabled some of this stuff. I'm sorry to tell you. So if I click this, now it's preventing default anyway, right? And I'm getting zeros for this kind of stuff. If I start typing in some stuff, some values, and I type in an email address, and hello, and I click send, right? And if I click cancel, it's going to take me back. But if I start typing something else in there, so if I type in Tom, it should give me autocomplete values for this, right? Unfortunately, it doesn't. So if I go in there and start typing in again, it's supposed to give me autocomplete. But Chrome, latest version, stops from happening. Especially with my light server, it doesn't autocomplete, right? Where normally it would. So even if I put autocomplete true, it's not going to work. Autocomplete is actually bad in a lot of ways. Why? Because then if I go back, if another user used the form before me, and if it's something that's critical, like that's sensitive, then I have his data. I can log in automatically with autocomplete. I can do a lot of things, right? So I always want to turn autocomplete off anyway from a security perspective. But if you look at the PowerPoint, which we just kind of scratched the surface of right now, these are the properties of the form, right? And then again, this when the submit button is clicked here, and I can also do something like check validity and submit. We're going to do that tomorrow. Also, I just want you just to get the most out of tomorrow's session before we end for the day. I also want to state that we're going to look at the PowerPoint from lesson 9, from week 9. I'm going to take an excerpt from that PowerPoint, and I'm going to be talking about regular expressions tomorrow for the first time. So please take a look at the PowerPoint for tomorrow, week 9, if you want to kind of read ahead from about page 17 on. So I'm going to be talking about regular expressions. Any questions around today? So we talked about, just to recap before we go, Babel. We talked about Babel. We talked about your assignment 2 is due Friday at midnight, right? Please don't forget that, right? So those kind of things are happening. We also talked about more about TypeScript and JavaScript and different versions of JavaScript that are out. The new standards. We talked about the function, fat arrow functions. We kind of introduced those today really, really quickly. And the backtick interpolation that we added in for ECMAScript 6. Tomorrow we'll continue and we'll do all validation tomorrow. All right? Guys, thanks so much. I'll put this up on GitHub in a second.